My name is Linda Peters, and I am a student, an international student from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, studying at University of Wales Trinity St David, Lampeter campus. Isabel Wilkerson, in her book entitled Castle. Not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they're ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands. Unaddressed, the ruptures and diagonal cracks will not fix themselves. The toxins will not go away, but rather will spread, leach, and mutate as they already have. When people live in an old house, they come to adjust to the idiosyncrasies and outright dangers sulking in an old structure. They put buckets under a wet ceiling, prop up groaning floors, learn to step over that rotten wood tread in the staircase. The awkward becomes acceptable, and the unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. Live with it long enough, and the unthinkable becomes normal. Exposed over the generations, we learn to believe that the incomprehensible is the way that life is supposed to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda, for sharing this most powerful quote. Now, hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to the 7th and the final program of the UNESCO's webinar series. These events, as you know, are co-convened by the UNESCO's Roots of Enslaved Peoples Project and the Global Humanity for Peace Institute at the University of Wales Trinity St David. My name is Scherto Gill. I'm the director of the Institute, and it has been such a privilege for me to bring together these wonderful speakers and hold a space for their thought-provoking conversations. Well, indeed, the purpose of these webinars is precisely to offer a space for dialogue about some of the most difficult topics of our time. Now, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of these events so far. Our first program started in the spring. At the opening webinar, UNESCO Assistant Director General Gabriela Ramos and the BBC journalist and historian Zainab Badawi outlined the imperative of understanding our histories from the perspectives of those who have lived through the histories, especially when we are examining the lived realities of enslavement, colonization, genocide, and violent displacement. During the second webinar, Doctors Joy de Guru and Thomas Hubel presented the psychosomatic consequences of these dehumanizing acts. They discussed the intergenerationally transmitted trauma experienced by people of African indigenous descent, and they highlighted the imperative of collective healing. In our third session, Professor Ali Moussaye and Dr. Esther Amar drew our attention to the origins of racial distinction. They pointed out that narratives were deliberately packaged and employed to impose a hierarchy of human existence and to frame our social relations in such a way to ensure that people of darker skin color can be instrumentalized, exploited, and oppressed. In the summer, and really shortly after California announced its proposal for reparation, Professor Ana Lucia Arrojo and the First Nation elder Luis Cardinal analyzed the needs for understanding transformative reparation through the lenses of restoration, reconciliation, and regeneration. And then comes autumn. The elders and the youth of both African indigenous descent on 4 continents added their voices as they just completed the one-year pilot for UNESCO intergenerational dialogue and inquiry circles. They shared the emerging cultural wisdom for resilience and the communal resources for healing. Last 2 months, as our world is once again facing even more turbulent times, Dr. Gail Christopher and Rob Corcoran shared their experiences over the decades dedicated to racial healing and trust building in all corners of the planet. They offered some practical steps key to transforming traumatized communities. So that's the very brief outline of the previous webinars. Now, the notion of architecture has long been applied in the arena of public health to visualize frameworks and structures that can support spaces, processes, cultures, but also practice of healing and well-being. To help us consider what might constitute a global healing architecture are two esteemed leaders, Linda Tinio, and who is the Deputy Chief of UNESCO Rights, Inclusion and Intercultural Dialogue Section, and Lord John Alderdice, a psychiatrist by profession, a Northern Ireland politician, and who's renowned for taking a relational and analytical approach to understanding intercommunal conflicts and supporting global Indigenous communities' healing and transformation. Linda and John, I now turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Scherto. Thank you. And thank you to the Grande Hermes Foundation for Peace for your constant support towards our collective healing initiative. I would like to extend greetings to Lord Alderdice and Professor Elwyn Evans, as well as those who are connected with us today. Allow me to start by thanking the University of Wales Trinity St David that made this webinar series possible. And as Scherto underlined earlier, this webinar series has been a real success. And on behalf of UNESCO, I thank all those who participated. Reuniting hundreds of participants at each session, we have highlighted the latest research exploring the psychotraumatic consequences of enslavement and explored concrete mechanisms for healing and valorizing impacted communities' traditional coping mechanisms. If there is a legacy of trauma that must be addressed, there is also a legacy of healing that should be celebrated. And I thank you, Scherto, for doing this very insightful summary of the different series. And that is really something, there are a lot of takeaways that can be preciously stored in our hearts and in our minds as we listen to this webinar series. I am also grateful that this webinar enabled to shed light on the UNESCO Roots of Enslaved Peoples project, under which the Collective Healing Initiative is implemented. With the support of the Grande Hermes Foundation for Peace, we have trained 40 young adults within impacted communities in Colombia, Kenya, Nigeria, the UK, and the US to become facilitators and resource persons to heal their counterparts. Some of them took part in the webinar series to testify on this deep and transformative experience and share how they will take advantage of this training to implement social transformation. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the time to act is now. The psychotrauma of enslavement and colonialism, its legacies, and the oppressive systems which perpetuate these traumas continue to take a toll on the lives of Afro-descendant peoples. The psychological trauma of racial discrimination may increase cortisol, or the body stress hormone, and weaken the immune system, potentially leading to elevated blood pressure, memory problems, and some deadly conditions. I just would like to cite a few statistics. Suicide among Black people is becoming a growing crisis. Among teenagers and young adults, suicide deaths have increased more than 45% for Black Americans between 2012 and 2019. We cannot lose generations yet again due to racism. As resilient as enslaved peoples and their descendants continuously prove to be, no healing will ever be complete without structural change. The latter should be at the heart of the global architecture of healing, and UNESCO is committed to act for strengthening just and peaceful societies. I just got back from Sao Paulo, where our team organized the 3rd edition of the Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination. And in this forum, we were very fortunate to reunite ministers, civil society representatives, and artists. We all shared good practices to put racial equity at the forefront of development agendas. In this framework, we were lucky to launch the network of anti-racism and anti-discrimination officials. And this network aims to bolster the development of innovative and inclusive policy solutions towards peace, equity, and non-discrimination. This network will also be the platform for the release of a report called the UNESCO Global Outlook Against Racism and Discrimination, which will aim to deliver regional viewpoints and data concerning racial discrimination in the digital realm, providing important resources for the framing of policies that address the impacted communities' needs. Developing research and data on the matter is essential to detect disparities and inequalities and design effective countermeasures. And through its direct access to its 194 member states, UNESCO is willing to address this need. I am glad that the University of Wales Trinity St David is our research partner to document the scope of psychotrauma and reflect with impacted communities on how to implement structural healing. This kind of multi-sectoral partnership is a great example of what we can accomplish when we all join forces. And this great collaboration is not over. This is just the beginning. Next year, we will extend our intergenerational healing workshops to other regions, including the Caribbean. Building on young people's commitment to create sustainable change in their communities and beyond, we are also in the process of co-creating a Future Leaders Academy for Healing, Justice, and Well-being, developed with youth, by youth, and for youth. This innovative endeavor will support young people from deprived communities, and in the implementation of their projects tackling racial inequalities and exclusion, UNESCO is ready to support them. With mentors and researchers, they will acquire skills on policy framing through training workshops to advise policymakers on a set of recommendations on structural conditions for collective healing, social justice, well-being, and enduring social transformation. Building the leadership of young people is instrumental if we wish to support them properly in their innovative projects. Our planet today counts the largest generation of young people in human history. However, while youth continuously demonstrate their sensitivity to issues of social justice through collective action and activism, they are rarely engaged as decision makers and involved in processes of governance. And we would like to prevent this type of youth tokenism. For example, the global proportion of political leaders aged under 30 was only 2.6% in 2021, with marginalized communities represented even less. Through projects such as the Future Leaders Academy, UNESCO, and its partners, we aim to generate genuine opportunities for youth to lead the way in social transformation and have their voices heard at the highest levels. I am very privileged to share this session with Lord John Alderdice, who has committed his life to peace building and is an example of a thoughtful leader. Throughout his career, he made sure that youth's needs and expectations were heard, as he rightly understood the key role that it could play in maintaining peace and social cohesion. The world needs strong leaders such as Lord Alderdice and Ms. Gabriela Ramos, the UNESCO Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences, who opened this series last April, as Scherto mentioned. Through her leadership, Ms. Ramos scaled up the actions of UNESCO in the fight against racism and discrimination, with the production of innovative reports such as the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence adopted by member states in 2021. There is also the launch of the partnership called the North American Partnership for Equity and Racial Justice, combining the USA, Canada, and Mexico, strong forces that are showing their real commitment to the fight against racism and discrimination. All these topics and accomplishments and progress will be addressed throughout next year with the celebrations of the 30th anniversary of the Roots of Enslaved Peoples Project, to which you are all invited. And as one speaker already said, pain that is not addressed is transferred. So together, let's face history and build healed communities for a sustainable future. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our upcoming discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Linda, for your marvelous introduction and for your very kind words. And I would echo your appreciations to the others who've been involved in setting this event up, and particularly to Scherto and colleagues at the University of Wales Trinity St David and also at the foundation. I'm very interested in this use of architecture as a kind of motif or model for our conversation about these issues. And I was very interested in the marvelous and very powerful presentation at the start, which described what it is like when you inherit a piece of architecture, a home, a place, building. That spoke to me because my wife and I live in a house which was built in the 1600s, really quite a long time ago. It's very interesting to sit there sometimes on a winter evening and wonder what was going on in the community in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s. What were all of the things that were going on in those times? And when we think about architecture, the introduction pointed out, we inherit an old building that has all sorts of quirks. It may have things that don't work very well, leaking roof or plumbing that's not so good. The question is, what do we do about that? Do we simply allow ourselves to get used to it, or do we try to change it? Do we adapt our way of living to the place in which we live, or do we try to adapt the place in which we live to the way in which we want to conduct our lives? Our eldest son is an architect, and it's been interesting watching him as he engages with clients. And what he usually does is to go and spend a bit of time with them, observing how they live in their homes and asking them how they live. And he says it's very interesting because they'll start very quickly saying, well, now we want this and that room and so on in the house. He said, no. Before you start telling me about the design, tell me about the way you live and want to live. And then let's fit the design around that. It was the same in our peace process in Northern Ireland. We didn't come to it by importing a peace process from somewhere else. We started by exploring the question of the disturbed historic relationships that were in the community, then constructed a peace process that recognized those disturbed relationships and all of those who were involved and got them to engage together to construct a new way forward. Because that's the question, not so much just what is the architecture of where you live and how you live, but what is the way in which you wish to live? How do you want to change that? And then can we think about producing structures that will mirror that will enable that. Because architecture really is about creating structures within which we can live at a personal or family level. That's a house, a home. But at a community level, building a structure within which we can live is about the kinds of relationships that we want to have in the different parts of our communities. And good governance is really finding a way of living together with mutually enriching relationships between communities. Now, when I started to work on this many years ago in a divided community that was in violence, there were a number of things that became quite clear to me fairly quickly. The first one was that there was at least one of the communities that felt humiliated and disrespected, didn't feel that they were being treated properly in that regard. And to try to address that, it was very important to ensure that we treated people respectfully, not that we agreed with them, not even that we always felt respectful, but it was very important to deal with each other in a respectful way. If not, we were simply continuing and repeating the humiliation and disrespect. The second thing that we noticed was that people had a very strong sense that they had not been fairly treated. The past had been an unjust past. And if we were going to change it and for things to become better, then it was important to try to create things that were more fair, to develop an approach that was more fair to people. Now, I use the word fair rather than just, because sometimes just has a kind of legal sense. You know, if we've set down rules and when we fulfill the rules, then it'll all be all right. Well, not necessarily. The law can sometimes be an unfair law. And implementing the law, even if it's not unfair, it can be implemented in a way which is felt to not be fair. And it's that sense of unfairness, that feeling of being treated unfairly, that's very powerful and destructive and even toxic. And the third thing was to make sure that it was possible to change things from the old way in the past to a new and better way, but to try to do it peacefully and democratically. That is to say, by argument, discussion, debate, persuasion, even by voting, but not by the use or the threat of the use of violence. And the problem is, if there is that humiliation and disrespect, and it goes on for a long time, and a community feels it strongly, and if there's a lot of unfairness around, and people feel it very strongly, and if there's not a way of resolving it peacefully and democratically, then people will get very angry and frustrated. And that's exactly the kind of environment where they don't want to build a new architecture. They want to blow up all the architecture that there is. Instead of wanting to try to engage in the structure of society and improve it, they simply want to wreck and destroy it. And unfortunately, there are now quite a lot of places around the world where people feel very, very strongly that things are not happening in their interest and they want to wreck and destroy it. Sometimes people feel that, well, they know the solution. And this is perhaps particularly a failing of populations and governments and people in Western societies. They feel that they've gone through a process of enlightenment, it's even sometimes called that, in which they understand what is the best way of running things. One of the philosophers of the present time, Francis Fukuyama, thought that liberal democracy marked the end of the evolution, the social evolution of humanity, that, you know, we've arrived, we know the truth, we know the way to deal with things. And of course, it's not like that at all. We're all developing, sometimes moving forward, sometimes slipping back because we've taken a wrong road or things aren't working out very well. And this is one of the places, I think, where there is actually a tremendous opportunity for us to construct communities and society and build a new architecture for society globally in a better way, because we all know in our hearts, and maybe even more obviously than that things aren't working very well. The economy of the world is in trouble. Politics is not working very well. There's a lot of difficulty and division and even increasing violence. And if that continues, it can either breed more violence, destruction, and quite possibly bring about the end of humanity. There's nothing that says humanity will always exist. It might not. We have other animals who have disappeared. They've become extinct. And there is a very real danger that either through a climate catastrophe or through nuclear war, we could bring the existence of humanity to an end. That's a real possibility. Of course, it's not the only possibility. There's also a possibility that we could learn, change, develop. And here's where I believe not only the established cultures that are in government and in places of power, but many indigenous communities have a huge role to play. Why? Well, it seems to me that many Indigenous peoples have not forgotten some really important things about people, about community, about values and structures, and about how to engage with the rest of the environment. Not to deal with the environment as though it was something over there, but to understand we're part of the environment and how to engage with that as part of the environment. They haven't forgotten that. And if we can find a way, we can engage in a conversation where people from a different background, a background that would regard itself as more developed, and of course it is true that there have been all sorts of scientific and knowledge and other developments, but we have to engage with each other, and remember that word from earlier on, respect. If we engage with each other and it's not done in the context of respect, well, then it's not going to work out for anybody's benefit. And that other word, fairness, that's really important as well. If people in Indigenous communities or people from ethnic minorities or people who have been racially abused in the past and even in the present feel that they're not being treated fairly, that they're continuing to be treated disrespectfully, well, then things aren't going to work out very well. And then that peaceful, democratic development, change, building new structures by conversation, debate, and persuasion all crumbles. It's destroyed. It's destroyed by violence between peoples that is in nobody's best interests. And so I think that's the hope, that's the commitment, that's what we have to give ourselves to, listening to all the different voices, and we're not going to all agree. This is really very important to understand. We're not all going to agree. We're going to have different values. We're going to want different kinds of things. We're going to want to live in different kinds of ways. And therefore, any effort to homogenize the world community and say, well, we all have to live in such and such a way, we all have to have such and such sets of beliefs, that's not going to work, because there are very fundamental differences. But if we can understand those differences, if we can appreciate them, then we have something that has really wonderful possibilities. I sometimes say to people, you know, a diamond never sparkles and produces the brilliance that's possible by creating all the facets facing the same way. It only works because someone with skill and understanding is able to create the different facets of the gemstone, and then the light really sparkles and it becomes something very precious and something of enormous value. And it's the same with our global community. It won't work and it won't sparkle and it won't be enriching if we're all made to face the same way and have the same values. It will only really sparkle for us if we understand the differences and treat each other with respect and fairness and work in a peaceful way.
So the question would be, what kind of a public space can we imagine in this kind of a global architecture for healing and just world? And what kind of a dialogue can we nurture in those public spaces?
Thank you, Scherto, and thanks, Lord Alderdice. That's very inspirational what you talked about, the differences, but there's harmony. It reminds me of a UNESCO publication a few years ago, Agree to Differ. And I think this is something that that's a reality that we have to face. As you may know, UNESCO is an intergovernmental organization. So our first interlocutors are, of course, governments, ministries. However, in the process of policy making, we have always tried to include the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of these policies themselves. So especially in this social and human science sector, we are trying to create this dialogue space where even the communities, the marginalized communities, those that are most affected, have a voice. I think this is the aim of what we created in the Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination. It's the only platform currently at the moment where we gather not only ministers, mayors, policymakers, academia, experts, but we also invite those that are the most vulnerable. So Lord Alderdice talked about the indigenous peoples. we invited a big number of indigenous peoples in the 3 editions of our global forum, and we think that their voice is as valuable as the voice of a minister, for example. So this is really a genuine engagement that UNESCO is trying to put forward. We would like to hear from them and talk about how also this space, this dialogue space, allows the policymakers to really get through the issues with the real testimonials, with the genuine testimonials coming from these affected communities. It was very inspiring to listen, for example, to even those, the indigenous peoples who are not only with this label as an indigenous person, but some of them also being affected because they are women, because they have a disability, because they are at the lower echelon of the socioeconomic strata. So all these interacting intersectionally sheds light on how the realities are, and it gives this strong testimonial that policymakers are ready to listen to. So we think at UNESCO that creating these spaces, and like the spaces that we create now, especially having a policymaker, like someone like Lord Alderdice, is genuinely committed to this cause, having youth engage in these conversations, I think this is the way that we have to do policy making now and in the future, involve more of those who are affected. Another thing that we are also looking at is to ensure that these dialogue spaces can be also visible for those who do not want to listen. Because what is sometimes being criticized is we preach to the converted. But that is not what we want. We want to enlarge our scope of people who will listen to us. How do we preach to the unconverted? And we think that by bringing strong messages, by having testimonials of people who are really experiencing these traumas, for example, by exposing these different victims of conflict on those or trauma or those that are the most affected, listening to them, I think this is the way that we will be able to send a very strong message. So while we all value the spirit of equity, equality, social justice, I think the most important tool that UNESCO can have is the dialogue space that we create, the conversations that we have among these people who do not otherwise have this caisse de résonance, or this type of vehicle to speak and to be heard. And I thank partners like you, like the foundation, like universities, like people like Lord Alderdice, who have this hand really outstretched and holding out to UNESCO also with the same goals that we have to create inclusive societies. So I think this is the ingredient that we need, policy making together with those that are most affected. Over to you, Scherto.
I wonder if I might pick up on some of that, because I think while we can describe, as you very eloquently have, our ambitions, our desires, what we would like, I think if we don't acknowledge the distance between that and the way things actually are, then people listening and trying to understand will increasingly say, well, what you say is all very nice, but actually this isn't what's happening at all. If we take, for example, the United Nations, and you quite rightly say it's an intergovernmental organization, they're the only people who have a place at the top table. And you've described how you have tried to engage other minority groups, ethnic minority groups, indigenous peoples, and so on. And that's really good. But there are two problems of it. There are many problems, but there are two problems I'd pick up on that. The first is that there is no mechanism at all within the United Nations for those who are not in government, but are parliamentarians around the world, to be properly engaged. So if you're not in government, and of course there are lots of places around the world where governments are making very sure that nobody in the opposition, if the opposition even exists in a form that can be recognized, actually has any say at all. The United Nations can't do very much about that. So it seems to me that unless in the much talked about reform of the United Nations, there is not some kind of way of ensuring that those who are parliamentarians but not in government have a role. For example, having a global parliament emulating that of the EU. Now, there are real practical problems about that in terms of numbers of people and different systems and so on and so on. But it seems to me that part of the reason that the United Nations isn't a problem is because it's an intergovernmental organization and there is no other serious balance to that. The second thing is that when you're saying, well, you know, somebody who represents Indigenous people is just as important as a minister. Well, it's very well to say that, but the truth is they can't deliver, and the minister can. And that's a really fundamental difference, because without that, the Indigenous groups or leaders or ethnic minority leaders, whatever, are always in a supplicant role. They're put in a role where all the time they're asking about what they can have, what can be repaired, what they can be given. And that's not a basis for any kind of equitable relationship. There has to be a context where it's possible to give and take. That's why I talked about how important it is to recognize that Indigenous people have remembered things that some of the rest of us have forgotten. What that is to say is they have a contribution to make, not just a request to make, but a contribution to make. And finding ways of engaging with that. That's true of opposition parties as well. I used to work quite a lot with democracy building in various parts of the world, including with opposition parties. And for the first while, we tried to help them to do better. Party building, election training, election monitoring, and so on. And then we discovered a problem. And the problem was this. Every time these opposition parties, who seemed to be very fine people when they were in opposition, said all the right things, ticked all the boxes, when they got elected, they did exactly the same as the previous crowd did. They discriminated in the same kind of way. They became just as corrupt and so on. So you say, oh, well, that was just them. Let's try with the next group of opposition people. So you try with the next group. And hey, presto, the same thing happened again. There seemed to be something about getting it. And as we tried to look at that and try to understand it, one of the things we began to explore was how opposition parties and people felt and what they thought about themselves. And the problem was they all thought of themselves as governments in waiting. They didn't think of themselves as having a special role as opposition, other than to criticize the government, not just hold them to account, but criticize and oppose and so on, in order to tear them down and put themselves up. Instead of it being a constructive business, it was a destructive business, because it wasn't about enabling the government to see things in a better way, enriching the public dialogue and debate so that there was a better outcome. One of the things that we know is if you get a group of people together to work and they establish relationships, then more can come from that engagement than would ever come from any of the individuals on their own. The whole notion of systems and so on. And the thing, if you have a parliament which is simply about government and opposition, and it's not possible for people in the opposition to say, I've got an important role, which is to try to enrich the debate and discussion so that this government can do better governing, rather than, well, I want to tear these guys down and make them look terrible and do terrible things so we can get rid of them and we can get into government. Well, that's not going to work. And so it seems to me that we've got to struggle at the things that have not been working, not in order to say, well, nothing works, but to try to see how we might grow it and develop it in a better way. And it seems to me that constructing these kinds of relationships involves, indeed, as you quite rightly said, engaging the different elements. But even the United Nations itself has a fundamental problem. And of course, as we have seen lately, a fundamental problem about implementation of any decisions that are made because it's entirely dependent on those governments that are members to actually implement the things that have been decided or agreed. So I think we've got quite a lot of struggle to actually deliver on the things that you and I want to see.
Now, in terms of what you talk about, John, in the respect, and yes, creating space and inclusive space, this is a goodwill. How do we actually do dialogue so that there is respect, there can be trust? And at the moment, national politics tend to present a form of dialogue, not even dialogue, debate, that is antagonistic. And who from this aisle, if you have a political parties that the oppositions, who from this aisle could come the other side and say, oh my God, what you say really interesting, I totally agree. And someone said that that's a death of dialogue. You cannot go to the other aisle and say, I will agree, because you're betraying your own party politics. And so antagonism is given.
Well, the key thing is not agreeing with each other at all. It's about how to disagree with each other in a civilized and civil fashion. Often people say, oh, it's great that you got this agreement 25 years ago in Northern Ireland. I said, wait a minute. Yes, the agreement, that's super. But what we did was we found a way of disagreeing without killing each other. That's the thing that's really important. And one of the problems for people on the progressive side of politics, if I use that not terribly good terminology, is that actually when they speak about inclusivity, they don't actually want to include the people that don't agree with them at all. And the people that don't agree with them often don't want to sit down with them either. But for example, when there are people who have fundamentally different beliefs and attitudes about democracy, about gender, the role of women, all of these kinds of things, there's a great temptation to simply say, well, actually, those people are wrong and we're right, and we're going to try to make sure that we have our way. And that's absolutely fine, but it's not inclusive. Inclusivity involves engaging with, not agreeing with, but engaging with those with whom you fundamentally disagree. And that's not been characteristic of the, I was going to say dialogue or conversation, but there isn't a dialogue, there isn't a conversation. People are having a dialogue with their fingers in their ears. They're not actually listening at all. And it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to do this kind of thing. But without that, you simply become part of the continuing conflict. And that's where there's an enormous challenge. So finding ways in which you say, well, wait a minute, I don't agree with you. I'm highly unlikely ever to agree with you on this. But I do need to understand why you've come to this kind of perspective and conclusion. And I need to understand that in a way which is respectful of you and listens to you without necessarily agreeing with you at all.
Well, that's really interesting. Can we just stay with that for a moment, John and Linda, please join in. Is there an example in the political arena? Because we have seen John, of course, yourself, in conflict transformation in the community context, when people from different sides come together, when there's this kind of deep level of listening, and when you understand the lived realities of the other from emotional level, it's not only just cognitively, oh, abstractly, I know the kind of life you're living, but really emotionally tune in. When you are tuned into other people's lived reality, those disagreements dissolve. I have seen that in my own experience of working in peace and conflict transformation. Now, John, in your work in politics, are there examples? And Linda, in your work with global community, especially in terms of your section, you really advocate intercultural dialogue and so on. Can we just look at possibilities? Because, and then I will turn to the audience, they have lots of questions already.
Linda.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's very interesting that you asked that question, and I would like to link it to what Lord Alderdice said. Indeed, UNESCO is an intergovernmental organization, but I think we are evolving into a community of different networks. As I said, we are opening up these spaces to all the different communities and the ones affected themselves. Concretely, I'd like to share the experience we had in building what we call the roadmap against racism and discrimination. This is a document that was established with the 193 member states back then, without the US yet. So 193 member states, which addresses the global call against racism. So back in 2020, during the pandemic, as you know, there was a very strong support, Black Lives Matter, all those what we witnessed during the pandemic. So we saw the inequalities, injustice. And so member states have come together to say that we have to stop this. We have to concretize our commitment. And so they adopted this global call against racism. So how do you do that? We establish a roadmap against racism and discrimination. So this roadmap, in principle, should be outlining the different strategies and actions that UNESCO has to implement together with the member states. You can imagine the different perspectives that arose from these debates, how institutional and legal frameworks can be established, and how in some countries where there are no anti-racism, anti-discrimination legislative frameworks, it is very difficult to build new ones. So there were a lot of debates. Should we include the things about the rights of minorities, rights of indigenous peoples, rights of LGBT communities? It was a very rich discussion, and it was very difficult, of course, for UNESCO to find a convergence. But the challenge was that we had to look at the least common denominator, which is actually, as we said, the values of equity, equality, and social justice. We came up with a document that is, of course, not perfect, but there was some consensus among the 193 member states who were there, who adopted the roadmap against racism and discrimination. And the agreement was that it will be a rolling document that will be updated, changed, modified according to the context that we are living in. We had presented it a year ago. So now things have changed again. We are in the post-pandemic world. There are crises left and right. There are so many conflicts. So now we are engaging again in another set of a series of dialogues with member states, with different cohorts from the communities that are working with us. And we are ready to build a new version of the roadmap in the coming year. So I just would like to show that this is a concrete example of how, of course, there are challenges, but somehow we managed to find a way to get consensus building. And if we really look at how we can listen to these affected communities, then it makes the process of this decision making and strategy building at UNESCO even more realistic and even more concrete.
I had an old teacher many years ago in psychoanalysis, and he used to say, getting people better is so difficult that you have to get into your therapeutic quiver as many different arrows as you possibly can. And you've been describing one therapeutic arrow, which is of course very important. I'd like to touch on another one, a different kind of arrow, as it were. And that is the question of the development of relationships and where that can start. Now, there's often an assumption that the people who can make a difference on these things are the powerful people. They're the ones who appear to have the legal and financial and other things to their hand. But there's a problem about that. And the problem is, those are exactly the people who have no incentive whatever to change, because they have the power and they have all of these kinds of things. But there are some situations I've seen where those who were on the other side, the minority side, the underdog side, decided that they were going to find a way to change the narrative and change the story. This was true, for example, in Ireland with Sinn Féin, the IRA. They'd been trying to use violence to make the change for quite a long time. And they realized that it wasn't working very well for them. It wasn't actually making the changes that they wanted. And they'd always had this perspective that, you know, British government has to move, British government has to do this. And they decided, no, actually, we're going to change our perspective and our approach. And when they did that, actually all sorts of things began to change. But I had an even better example of it than that. It was when I was Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, one day I got a call to say that there were a number of chiefs of indigenous peoples in North America who wanted to come and see me. And I said, well, that's fine. I'd be delighted to see them. I have no idea why they want to see me, but I'm very happy to see them. And so they came along to me and they said, you know, we have had a lot of discussion about the difficulties in our communities. We have a lot of problems of alcoholism, drug abuse, physical and sexual abuse in relations between men and women and indeed children. And we're destroying ourselves. And we thought an awful lot about this. And we've come to the conclusion that one of the reasons there's a problem is because we have never forgiven your ancestors for what they did to our ancestors. And we want to try to do something about that. I said, well, that's very interesting indeed. And I have a lot of time for your thoughts about that. But what would you like to do? He said, well, we've come across the Atlantic to where your ancestors were before they left and came to the other side of the pond. And we've come to the Parliament and we want to do a forgiveness ceremony in public here in the Parliament. And I said, I think that's absolutely marvelous. And I'd be delighted. We'll have it in the Grand Hall where it will go right up through the building. People will hear it. They'll come down. They'll see what's happening. They'll ask questions and so on. And so that's what we did. And it was very successful. And we had a number of conversations. And that then began a kind of link backwards and forwards. So, and they said to me, well, do you ever come to the United States, for example? I said, well, I do from time to time. Well, I said, the next time you come, you must come and visit us and we'll do some things together. And the next time I went, it just so happened that there was also a troupe of Irish dancers who were over at the States at the same time. And so we all came down together, the Irish dancers, myself, indigenous people, their drums, feathers and leathers and dances and so on. And we spent some time together and we had a really very interesting and enjoyable experience. And that led to some other interesting things because some of the parliamentarians in some of the state parliaments, as well as in Washington, D.C., were interested in the Irish peace process for historical and other reasons. And they asked me if I would go along and meet with them. And I said, well, yes, I'm happy to go, but I want my friends here, the First Nation people, I want them to come with me. And I said, well, okay. And so we went in and we talked to the governor, talked to various representatives. And when I came out, I said to my First Nation friends, well, you know, how was that? And they said, you don't understand. I said, no, I'm sure I don't, but please tell me. They said, you see, that's the very first time that representatives of our community have ever been in that building officially, ever. And it's happened because they wanted to hear your story. This continued with a kind of what I would describe as a hiccuping process, you know, it didn't move smoothly. It bounced along a little bit. And just a month or so ago, I was in Atlanta in Georgia, which of course has a very long history of these kinds of things with the Trail of Tears and so on. And the reason I was there was because they had invited me to go to a ceremony between the elected representatives of the state of Georgia and the leaders of the indigenous peoples for them to read out a resolution that had been carried in the Senate, recognizing the historical damage that had been done, undertaking to build a new relationship, and then engaging in ceremonies, culminating the following day in going and planting a peace tree together and being photographed doing so and making something of the whole event. And the point about all of that is, it seems to me, all the reaching of agreements and signing things and so on is very important. Roadmaps, the things that you've mentioned. But also doing things together that are symbolically significant and that recognize some quite fundamental things about human relationships, like the problem of not forgiving damages you more than the person you haven't forgiven. These are really quite fundamental things, it seems to me, that can only be lived out. They can't be preached out, they can't be negotiated out, they have to be lived out and lived out in community. And to me, that's another one of the arrows for that therapeutic quiver.
Thank you. I think Linda says that she has a meeting to attend. Linda, before you go, just very quickly, we have a number of questions from the audience who are very patiently waiting. And John, it's actually, I think you will touch upon it, but these questions more later. We'll just let Linda to give it a brief outline in terms of UNESCO's action or roadmap in engaging the needs of Indigenous people. Indigenous people, there are so many different ways that Indigenous people in need of recognition in terms of their access to land, in terms of their way of life, and so on and so forth. But also we established, and through John's rendition, that some of Indigenous wisdom may become the guiding light as we move forward. So what is UNESCO's kind of overall strategy and also roadmap engaging Indigenous people? And I hope that will be the basis to respond to our colleague in the audience, Paul Lectura. Thank you, Linda.
Yes, thank you for that question. Thank you, Scherto. If I have my statistics right, I think there are around 476 million Indigenous peoples around the world, over living in more than 90 countries and speaking languages, different languages, of course, different cultures. And UNESCO recognizes this importance. There is a UNESCO policy on engaging with Indigenous peoples, which is available online. And this is a very important instrument that is implemented across the different program sectors of UNESCO. So in the education sector, culture, social and human sciences, natural sciences, and communication sector, there are different initiatives across the board, across the house, where Indigenous people's rights are actually highlighted as a priority group. There are different ways in engaging on how we can uphold these rights. So there are of course, the institutional frameworks. There are some programs in UNESCO where education systems are being enriched about how do we foster how do we promote Indigenous knowledge, for example, even in the areas of climate change. How do we make sure that Indigenous knowledge, centuries long knowledge, we have to listen to this wisdom that they have been advocating for centuries. There is a very rich program on Indigenous languages, for example. And in the realm of the social and human sciences, we engage with them through the roadmap that I told you about. So there is a very strong interest in making the work of UNESCO integrated in the policy, the UNESCO policy, and also looking at how we can bring into the picture the voices of these Indigenous people. So in all of the upcoming editions of the Global Forum, we will be engaging with them. Another thing that I can say is that we are offering partnerships to establish master classes. So this is the masterclass series against discrimination, where UNESCO collaborates with different partners, and we can design and co-organize these master classes with you if you're interested. This is something where we can zero in on the very important aspect, very important theme of the rights of Indigenous peoples. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Okay. John, there are lots of comments about how the audience were moved and by your presentation, but there's also questions about, for instance, I start with Marianne. We may have met her in Iceland, and she's our colleague from Brazil, and she said, what can be done to reach peace and live in a world where everyone feel belong and where everyone can be safe and dream more? And this is kind of it's very, very broad. This is a very broad question, and but there is also other kind of question, very specific. And for instance, the colleague from Nigeria, and she's asking, you know, how do we work through the kind of aftermath of that history, such as poverty and the lack of hope experienced in the continent. There are other questions. You probably can see them yourselves. I wondered if you could just start with kind of a general direction. How can people feel hope, and what we can do as people, politicians, me as an academic, and others as sort of NGOs and people in the community. What can we all do? It's almost like following the example of the indigenous people. What can we do in order to actually co-create that sense of hopefulness?
I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is a historical recognition that there have been times in history which have been pretty gloomy and bad. And then there have been times when things have moved forward in a positive way. In the very recent past history, for example, we had the terrible events of 2 world wars. And out of that emerged the European project, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so on and so on and so on. And so those times, I mean, I sometimes think quite a lot about how it must have been to live in the run into the First World War and the Second World War. What was that like? What was the expectation? And then what was it like when you were in the First World War and the Second World War? And the reason I do that is because it sometimes feels that that's the way we are now. And they came out the other end, one way and another. An awful lot of people died. There was terrible destruction and so on. But we came out of that and we tried to do better things. And I think one of the things that history does tell us is when things are really in a bad place, terrible, horrible things happen. No question about that. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. But as long as we survive, as long as humanity survives, it's possible for new and better things to come from that if people decide that they're going to work at it. So in terms of hope, history can sometimes describe to us all the bad things that can happen. But history can also tell us about how sometimes better things can emerge. We must acknowledge that history also tells us that when good things emerge, they are also not permanent. So the bad things aren't permanent. That's the good news. But the good things aren't permanent either, because they are about relationships between human beings individually and as whole communities. And relationships are not something that gets sorted. They're not something that are static. You can never say, well, that's that relationship sorted. As soon as you've thought that, it's already in trouble, because it's something organic. It has to be nourished and worked at and worked with. So that's the first thing I think that I would say. The second thing is that, there's the old joke about how do you eat an elephant? The answer is bite by bite or piece by piece, And the elephant here is, world peace. And if you try to eat that elephant, you'll just give yourself indigestion, But if you start to say to yourself, well, what sorts of things can I do in my community? First of all, what can I understand in my community? When I was a young fellow growing up, the question for me, it was in my community. I'd actually started with my wife-to-be, my fiancée at the time, planning to go out and do some stuff in Africa. We were medical students. We thought we might be able to be helpful in Malawi. We tried to go out, didn't work out. We ended up in Salford, just outside Manchester, which is nothing like Malawi at all. But we thought we would do something. And then we began to think, wait a minute, what are we from Northern Ireland trying to go away somewhere else to try to help people when things are a total mess at home? People are killing each other. It's all, we need to do some work here at home in Northern Ireland. So that's what we did. And I suppose that was for me an important lesson. But I think it's also worth sort of offering it also to other people and saying, maybe it's worthwhile to think about you in your place. Can you understand what's happening in your community with its divisions and its difficulties and so on? Can you begin to think about how you can engage in a way which is constructive and positive and gives some sense of hope to yourself and to other people in your community? Can you engage and listen to other people at a distance who may have some ideas for you that you can learn from them, or that you are, it's not even that you take their ideas and implement them, but in the conversation a new idea emerges for you, which makes you say to yourself, yes, I can't do what they did, but I've now been triggered to think about what I could do in my situation. And not to dismiss that or diminish that. And then I go back to something I said earlier on, and that is not to keep thinking to yourself, it's the powerful people who have to be persuaded to do the things, when actually they have no incentive to do that. If you're not one of those people, and you have the incentive, that's great. But if you're not one of those people, you have to understand there are things that you can do. And not to be dismayed, and not to be discouraged, and not to feel too low-spirited about it. And if, for example, Indigenous people are able to find a way of bringing to another community, the settled community or colonizing community, or whatever you want to call it, offerings of possibility. For example, Aboriginal people in Australia have for years worked with the environment there to make sure there weren't wildfires. And currently, there have been terrible wildfires. And some of the governments and some of the states have begun to consult with some of the Aboriginal people and say, look, you folk for hundreds, thousands of years have been managing this. Can we sit down and have a conversation about how you've been managing this? Because maybe you have some ideas that we don't have. And of course, if the Aboriginal people wouldn't engage, well, that wouldn't work out very well. But if they do engage, then everybody can benefit from that kind of conversation.
I think the relational approach that you highlighted is really important. Could you just, as a closing, give us some ideas from education to the community, from the community to the parliamentarian space? I come back to the original question that how do we actually create but also sustain this public space? Hannah Arendt called it a public space where we can actually hold the tension together without resolve to violence. How do we create and sustain such space in schools, communities, and politics? Can we just let this to be the final conclusion?
When you find yourself in a situation of conflict, whether it's your own community or another community, you will instinctively and almost immediately feel like you identify with one part of the conflict. If you go to a place where there's trouble, you'll immediately feel, like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. These are the people I identify with, and these people I don't identify with very much. When you feel that, it's a warning. It's a warning that you are about to become part of the conflict rather than part of the resolution of the conflict. So understanding that the problem is not this side or this side, the problem is the disturbed historic relationship between these people is absolutely essential if you're not simply going to become part of the conflict. It's very difficult all the time, internally and externally. The pressure is to move to splitting, to this side or this side. But if you hold on to say, no, let's pull it back. What has gone wrong in the relationship? What is the dynamic that's causing harm to everybody? And can we try to engage with that? If I'm getting into kinds of language and disposition and a kind of hectoring approach to things, and bang back into being part of the conflict again. So there are a number of things like this, and there isn't any way of inoculating yourself against it. It's something that you've constantly got to be thinking about and working at. This whole question of how do I engage in a way that's constructive, that's understanding, that's respectful, that's trying to be fair, and that's not identifying with one side of the conflict, but trying to get underneath to understand the nature of the disturbed relationship that is being expressed in conflict. It's not that this is not magic. It's not easy. It takes time and it's a struggle. But it is a possibility for us as a human race. And it is a possibility that may enable us to survive and even maybe thrive rather than disappear.
So thank you, John, for this concluding session of the UNESCO webinar series. And
thank you and congratulations on it, Scherto.
Thank you. And thank the audience for being here with us. And the UNESCO has decided to launch the next webinar series focusing on leadership. And Lord Alderdice, I hope that you will be joining us again next time when we talk about what constitutes leadership and how leadership can play an important part in good governance.
It'll be my pleasure.
Yeah, and for now, it's goodbye from us. Thank you.